Hi, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nadita Ramachala, and I'd like to welcome all the participants to our stakeholder consultation, where we will be discussing the requirements of the draft National Compulsory Standards for Labeling of Goods. So I will be your moderator today, and I would like to start the session by inviting our Executive Director Acting, Mr. Rodney Ramnath, to deliver some welcome remarks.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Nadita, are you hearing me?
Yes, go ahead, Rodney.
Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to address the participants at today's stakeholder consultation for the draft compulsory national standards for labeling of goods, including Tts Cs20, labeling of goods, general compulsory requirements, and Tts Cs20, labeling of goods, prepackaged goods, compulsory requirements. The Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards plays a key role in establishing labeling standards as part of its mandate as the national standards body under the Standards Act. One of its primary roles is to develop, promote, and enforce standards in Trinidad and Tobago. We are required to develop both voluntary and compulsory standards. Today's consultation focuses on two draft compulsory standards for labeling, based on the Standards Act, number 18 of 1997. A compulsory standard is a standard which is intended primarily, amongst other things, to require adequate information to be given to the customers or users, and prevent fraud or misrepresentation arising from misleading advertising or labeling. It is important to note that when standards are issued with compulsory status, the enforcement of these standards is done by Ttbs, mainly through two routes, either inspection by the Implementation Division or product certification by the Certification Division, whichever is most appropriate and applicable. Voluntary standards can generally be used by stakeholders at their discretion. Therefore, the development of compulsory labeling standards plays a key role with us fulfilling our mandate to ensure consumer protection. Product labels provide crucial information and instructions to customers and consumers. When purchasing consumer products, evaluating the product label is typically the final step in the buyer's decision-making process. Some consumers' decision to buy a product is informed by them reading a product's label while shopping. It is one of the essential means of communicating between the brand and the consumer. Once the sale is made, the label helps customers and consumers use the product correctly. A label can also help your product stand out and market the product all on its own. Consumers may be attracted to a brightly colored label and end up purchasing that product based on visibility. A high quality label can be the difference between getting the sale or not. The draft national standards had their genesis in two CARICOM regional standards, which were spearheaded by the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, also known as CROSQ, namely CRS 55, Labeling of Goods, Part 1, General Requirements, and Part 2, Specific Requirements for Prepackaged Goods. An important aspect of Ttbs's standards development work is participation in regional standards projects, as well as the adoption of regional standards issued by CROSQ. Once standards are approved as CARICOM regional standards, the intent is that these CARICOM standards become national standards in the various member states, since one of the key mandates of CROSQ is to harmonize standards and to facilitate intra-regional trade. CROSQ Act 2005, under Article 11, Adoption of Standards and Procedures, states, where the Council endorses a recommendation pursuant to Paragraph 1, Standards and Technical Regulation for Adoption, and commends it to quoted for approval, the state's parties shall, upon the approval of quoted, adopt appropriate legal and administrative arrangements to give effect to the decision of quoted within their respective jurisdictions. The mandate of CROSQ includes when these regional standards were being, When these regional standards were being developed, during the regional public comment stage, Ttbs held a stakeholder consultation to solicit comments, and numerous comments were submitted to CROSQ from Trinidad and Tobago via the Ttbs as the representative for Trinidad and Tobago at CROSQ. Once the regional standards were completed, Ttbs started the adoption process for the regional standards. However, we recognized that there was a need for more product-specific labeling requirements for the local market, and also to specify the requirements for compliance, as this would facilitate enforcement by Ttbs via the Implementation Division. Therefore, we are now ready and prepared to adopt these regional standards with national deviations to support CROSQ's mandate for harmonization. As such, the draft compulsory standards, once declared, will replace the National Compulsory Labeling Standards Tts 76, Requirements for Labeling, Part 1, General Principles, and Part 2, Labeling of Prepackaged Goods, which are currently being enforced by the Implementation Division. At today's session, we will hear from Ms. Nadita Ramachala, who is the manager of the Standardization Division, as she gives us a brief introduction into the national standard development process. Then, Ms. Williams, who is also part of the standardization team, will highlight some of the key requirements in both Tts Cs20 and Tts Cs20. Finally, we will have a presentation from the Implementation Division from Ms. Ram Narain, who will be providing an overview of the enforcement activity for labeling of goods. Stakeholders will have an opportunity to ask their questions, highlight their concerns, or even request clarification on certain aspects of the draft standards. It is important that you, the participants, voice any concerns before the finalization of the draft standards. We need your input to ensure that final standards are practical, relevant, and implementable in order to ensure that the main objective of protecting consumers and our society is realized. In conclusion, I encourage all participants to carefully review the draft standards being presented today and submit your feedback by the deadline date. I wish you all a very productive session. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rodney, for the welcome. So it is much appreciated that you gave the background as to the regional work which would have spearheaded our national adoption of the regional standards. So I will now start my presentation. So please allow me 1 minute while I bring up the presentation. Okay, so I will start the presentation on the standards development process. Now, most of the participants would have been exposed to Ttbs in some form or fashion previously, but I would just like to recap our mandates and highlight the key steps in the standards development process. Ttbs is a national standards body as well as the national quality certifying body. And we also have several other roles that are part of the quality infrastructure. We operate under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, and our measurement institutes and our metrology functions are covered under the Metrology Act number 18 of 2004. There are two key documents that will guide the operation of Ttbs, and these include the National Quality Policy, as well as our National Standardization Strategy. The quality policy outlines the framework for the national quality infrastructure development, while the National Standardization Strategy outlines our 3-year work program with our prioritized standards projects. The mission and vision of Ttbs. So our vision: to be the essential provider of national quality solutions leading to a standards-conscious society that is globally competitive. And we are also responsible for championing the development and implementation of standards, measurement systems, and conformity assessment services for the competitiveness and sustainability of our country. As I indicated, a lot of you all may already be familiar with the Ttbs and our operations, but just to highlight some of the key aspects at this point, we have the Standardization Division being responsible for coordinating national, regional, and international standardization. And we solicit feedback from stakeholders at all the different levels. As I indicated before, our metrology activities include industrial, scientific, and legal, covered under the Metrology Act. And we also have the Implementation Division being responsible for the enforcement of compulsory standards. In addition, a more recent development would be the issue of product certification, where there are local manufacturers for the compulsory standards that we have in several areas, including construction as well as chemical products, But the certification division also offers a number of schemes that relate to management systems, for example, ISO 9000, products, and tourism services. We also have support and lab services in areas of chemical, electrical, material, and fiber. A lot of work is done in the construction and electrical area at this time, as well as fiber. And we also have the responsibility of being the laboratory accrediting body. And we look at the accreditation of labs, medical labs, especially being a priority for the country. Now to turn to the standards related mandate of Ttbs. As I indicated earlier, we operate under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, and we're responsible for the development and maintenance for standards that serve several objectives, including the improvement of goods produced or used in the country to ensure industrial efficiency and development, to promote public and industrial welfare, health and safety, as well as the protection of the environment. As we go through today's session, my colleagues will be speaking specifically on two very important standards for labeling of goods. And this is aligned to our mandate for protecting consumers and ensuring that we receive value for money. As I indicated previously as well, we operate at several different levels of standardization. As Ttbs, we are the national standards body, but we also participate in regional standardization activities. CROSCU is the regional standards body for CARICOM. We also have another standards body that looks at the regional interests of Latin America, North America, as well as the Caribbean region, and they are called the Pan-American Standards Commission, or COPANT. And we also participate in the International Organization for Standardization, as well as the International Electrotechnical Commission. And this organization, the IEC, is responsible for primarily electrical standards. We need to discuss what is a standard so that we have a common understanding. It is essentially a technical document that provides an agreed upon repeatable way of doing something. And generally, standards can span several different forms, but essentially we can look at the technical requirements, and we can also look at services under the umbrella of a standard. When used effectively, standards are generally used to facilitate trade, ensure health and safety, protect the environment, promote innovation, and it provides a common and a benchmarked way of doing something. We have standards that are part of our daily lives. Anything grown, produced, and traded is subject to standards. You would see that for Ttbs, we have a number of standards that cover electrical, construction, goods, labeling, energy efficiency in products, as well lighting, as well as electrical appliances. We also have a number of service standards for the tourism industry. And more recently, we developed a suite of standards that cover information communication technologies, or ICT. So really, we can cover any product or service with a standard. At the Ttbs and under the Standards Act, we have two main types of standards that we would develop. The first being voluntary, and these represent the minimum levels of acceptability for a product or service. They are market-driven and can be adopted at the discretion of the businesses or the private sector. Now, in terms of compulsory standards, and we have been using the terminology conformity assessment documents, this is where Ttbs has the legal mandate to enforce the requirements of a compulsory standard, and there are very specific criteria in the Standards Act where we can develop compulsory standards, and essentially looking at health and safety of users or the environment, as well as consumer protection to prevent misleading information from being provided to the consumer. So our labeling standards would really fall under the main bucket of protecting the consumer. And the compulsory status is conferred by the Minister of Trade and Industry. And I should mention that the Ministry of Trade and Industry is also a line ministry. So we have recently revamped our process for developing compulsory standards, and there are several key reasons for this. We are party to the World Trade Organization. We are a member, as Trinidad and Tobago, and there is an obligation or an agreement called the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. And this would essentially be the platform of where we have to consult our international trading partners to ensure that our requirements being set at the national level are open, transparent. Countries have the opportunity to submit comments on products that will be regulated by the Ttbs. The compulsory standard is known in the international community as technical regulations, and we have been following good regulatory practices because essentially Ttbs has this key regulatory function of setting and enforcing compulsory standards. So we will start off with the first stage. First, there has to be the need identified, and Ttbs has approximately under 90 compulsory standards at this time, and they are all aligned to our mandate in the Standards Act. The criteria being health, safety, environmental protection, consumer protection. And we would first get the need identified. It can come from stakeholders or it can be internally identified. We have been proceeding with a 3 to 5 year revision. So we're in the process of updating our entire suite of compulsory standards. We would conduct technical research. And one of the changes that we have recently made is that we will consult with stakeholders, and the voluntary standards development process, it remains a consensus-based process. However, for compulsory standards, we will establish an internal Ttbs advisory committee and seek feedback from stakeholders like yourselves. So we would prepare a committee draft, we would issue for public comment, and I mentioned the very important World Trade Organization and the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. We are bound by this agreement to circulate the draft internationally to allow feedback to come in from all our trading partners, all the members of the WTO, as well as our national stakeholders. And one key aspect of our Standards Act is the public comment period, which we are currently in for these two standards, so these two draft standards. We have used a minimum of 60 days for our comment period in alignment with the international requirements. We would seek feedback from stakeholders directly and also host stakeholder sessions like this to get direct feedback. Once we have received all the comments, we would resolve the comments using our internal advisory committee. And again, the difference in the process for compulsory versus voluntary would be that we rarely consult with the stakeholders. But as Ttbs, with this regulatory function, the final decision would be taken by Ttbs. And based on the comments received, we would address them with the internal advisory committee. Then we would have our Ttbs board of directors approve the standard. And this is really what we would say, according to the Standards Act, the declaration process. So the next step after that would be to obtain a legal notice of declaration. And this is the notification that our Ttbs board of directors has reviewed and approved the standard. After which we will get a compulsory standards order published in the Trinidad and Tobago Gazette. And as I mentioned, the Minister of Trade and Industry is responsible for giving that compulsory status to the standard. So these legal notices, there is a notice of intention to declare the standard compulsory, and this is followed by the very official and formal gazetting process, with the compulsory standards order being that instrument that gives Ttbs the power to enforce. Now, as Rodney would have indicated, we have been looking at two main routes for the enforcement of standards, and we have our inspection body looking at products that come in at the ports of entry, and for goods that are locally manufactured, we will also have the certification division. In the case of these two labeling standards, the main route of enforcement would be via the inspection process. Now, I would like to highlight our national standardization strategy, because this is essentially our prioritized standards projects over a 3-year period. We would have developed this methodology using input from stakeholders to get the interest that the country would have. So we would have looked at GDP, export potential, issues that have significant social impact, for example, addressing some of the concerns with persons with disabilities, We recently issued a standard for driver controls, so the vehicle modifications that are needed to facilitate access by persons with disabilities, and any key government initiatives. Recently, we have been focused on energy efficiency as well as sustainability requirements, and recently issued standards for electric vehicles in support of the government trust to become more sustainable. So I encourage all the participants to take a look at our standardization strategy. It is available on our Ttbs website, so go ttbs.com. And please send us any feedback if there are any standards that you believe should be updated, because we are engaged in a significant revision of our compulsory standards at this time, as well as identify any new standards that we may need to support the economic development of our country and address any sustainable development goals, as well as the Vision 2030. More recently, we have been engaged in a lot of the emerging areas of standardization at the international level, a key focus being on sustainability, climate change, as we have seen with some of the recent discussions at COP26. Also, we have been promoting the governance of organization standard. It is a brand new international standard to help companies improve trust, accountability, performance, and achieve environmental and social goals. We are also engaged in international standardization activities related to the circular economy, and we have also been monitoring developments related to innovation, smart cities, road traffic management systems, e-commerce, and sustainable building materials. So this is the end of my presentation. And if there are any questions, please let us know. We can take questions in the chat, and I will now stop sharing my screen. So please allow me one moment to do so. I will now turn the session over to Ms. Nkechi Williams, and Nkechi is the standards officer responsible for these two labeling standards, and she has been at Ttbs for 13 years and responsible for the development of a number of standards in the areas of tourism, quality, consumer goods, labeling, and ICT. And she has a thorough working knowledge of the national, regional, and international standards development processes. So she's the primary contact for these standards projects. I'll turn the session over to Nkechi to go through the requirements and highlight the key requirements of these draft standards. So Nkechi, please proceed.
Good morning, everyone. So today I will be doing a brief presentation on the draft labeling standards for labeling of goods, Tts Cs20 and Tts Cs20. So just in terms of a little history of the draft standards, currently we have two national standards for labeling, Tts 76 Part 1 and Tts 76 Part 2. Right, these two standards here. Both of these standards are currently being enforced by the implementation division, but prior to that, for Part 1, we had a standard Tts 76 Part 1, 1997, 1994, and Part 2 was a 1976 draft. Where we want to go now is here, Tts Cs19 and Tts Cs20. So this is the next step for these two standards. And as previously mentioned, these standards are based on regional standards, 55-1 and 55-2. So starting with Tts Cs19, that's the general standard, and it outlines compulsory requirements, right? So this standard, once it's declared, will replace the existing standard, which is the Tts 76 Part 1, 2006 version. As was mentioned earlier, the standard is being recommended for compulsory status to prevent fraud or misrepresentation arising from misleading labeling. This standard is intended to be used by a wide range of stakeholders, including manufacturers, importers, distributors, retailers, and wholesalers. So they can use this standard to basically determine what product information is necessary and provide like a proper description of the goods being sold, distributed, and used in Trinidad and Tobago. For purchasers and consumers, the standard can be used so that they can have an understanding of what information is placed on a label and how that information could assist them in making their final decision to purchase. So the main document used is the CRS 55-1. And that standard was actually based on a review of some of the requirements from a Trinidad standard, a Barbados standard, the Jamaica standard, and they also looked at the US Food and Drug Administration food labeling guideline. So these one regulation and 3 national standards were used to create the regional standard CRS 55-1. This slide is just a look at what the standard, the contents of the standard. So we have the scope, the terms and definition, requirements, conflict with other standards, and the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. We have the mechanism to demonstrate compliance and the measures related to non-compliance. So the scope of this standard says, the standard establishes general labeling requirements for goods. It applies to all goods which are sold, distributed, or used in Trinidad and Tobago. So we have some exceptions to the scope. First exception, goods or classes of goods for which labeling requirements have been prescribed in national regulation issued by other government ministries or agencies. 1, goods or classes of goods for food, drugs, cosmetics, and devices. So for food, drugs, cosmetics, and devices, we look to the Chemistry, Food, and Drug Division, Ministry of Health, as they are empowered to draft the regulations, any regulatory requirements, which include standards-related matters for those categories. And for the other exception we have is for goods for pesticides and toxic chemicals. The division responsible for that is the Chemistry, Food and Drug Division under the Ministry of Health. Next exclusion we have is for specific labeling requirements prescribed in another compulsory national standard. So I'll give you an example for that. For example, we have a labeling standard, Tts Cs20 2021. That's energy labeling for CFLs and LEDs, compulsory requirements. So once we have a national compulsory standard for a specific product, then that standard would take precedence over this standard. And the other exception is goods for agricultural produce. So in terms of the terms and definition, so I just highlighted 2 terms that I thought were important. Good, any commodity, article, product, or thing, and label. Any tag, ticket, brand, mark, pictorial, or descriptive matter written, printed, stenciled, marked, embossed, impressed on, accompanied, or attached to a container. So let's just look at some of the general requirements within this standard. So we start. A label shall provide a description of the good and adequate information to enable a potential consumer or user to select the goods best suited to their needs. So Next requirement, provide a purchaser or user with appropriate instructions for use. This can include storage, handling, installation, maintenance, stuff like that, of course, where necessary. State the name, address, and the electronic or telephone contact of the manufacturer or the organization responsible for the sale. Be legible and durable up to the point of sale. Be in a minimum type size equal to or greater to 1.2 millimeters when only uppercase letters are used, and be in a minimum type size equal to or greater than 0.9 millimeters when mixed upper and lowercase letters are used. So how we measure that? We look at the height of the letter O or the letter X, and we use that height to measure, right? And of course, the standard goes into more detail. So the standard also speaks about prevention of deception. So a claim shall not be made on the label unless it can be substantiated. A good shall not be described or presented in a manner that is false, misleading, or deceptive. The language that is used for the label is English, and in terms of who is responsible for the label, it is the responsibility of any person who manufactures, sells, or distributes any goods to ensure that they are labeled as required by the standard. So when the goods are not new, they shall state, clearly state, right? If they are secondhand or used, if they are defective, if they are second, irregular, imperfect, or if they are rebuilt, reconditioned, refurbished, remanufactured, or renewed. So within the standard, we actually have definitions for each of the terms highlighted here. So for example, for the secondhand or used, it's defined as goods or parts of goods that have been in service and that are re-entering a market for sale, lease, or use by a second user or an end user. For second, irregular, and imperfect, it is defined as goods which do not fully satisfy the specific requirements for the particular good, having defects or is incomplete, but which still fulfills intended usage requirements. And for rebuild, reconditioned, refurbished, remanufactured, or renewed, within the standard is defined as goods which have been overhauled, repaired, refitted, or have undergone a similar process to be made reusable to meet applicable technical standards or regulatory requirements, with the result of making it fully functional good to be used for a purpose that is at least the one for which it was originally intended, including such activities as cleaning and data sanitization. So for these categories of goods, they shall fulfill additional safety and performance requirements outlined in specific goods standards where applicable before it is sold or distributed in Trinidad and Tobago. So in terms of conflict with any other standards or laws of Trinidad and Tobago, the labeling requirement of any product-specific compulsory national standard shall take precedent over this standard. So one such example was the Tts Cs20, which I mentioned earlier. That was a product-specific compulsory standard, CFD, and LED lamps. And next conflict, the requirements for any labeling standards for specific goods or category of goods shall take precedent over this standard, right? Another example we have is Tts Cs1, 2018, a liquid chlorine bleach, right? If that standard has labeling requirements, the labeling requirements within that standard would be enforced for liquid chlorine bleach. So that will take precedence over the general labeling requirements within the standard. So to demonstrate compliance, right, we have it categorized for new goods. So for new goods, they need to comply with all the requirements outlined in the standard. And then Ttbs may consider and accept information from other sources such as third-party testing, product certification, or quality management system certification from an accredited body. Ttbs reserves the right to sample and test for compliance to the standard. And for the category of goods other than new, these shall be subject to sampling and testing for compliance to the standard at the expense of the manufacturer, importer, or distributor. This is very important. Goods categorized as secondhand, Ttbs reserves the right to sample, inspect, and test all goods on a 100% basis for compliance to the standard at the expense of the local manufacturer, importer, or distributor. So in terms of measures related to non-compliance, where importer or local manufactured goods are found to be in breach, Ttbs shall initiate any of the following actions. So we could direct that the non-conforming good be removed. We could seize and detain the non-conforming good. We could prohibit the sale and distribution of the non-compliant good, and we can also permit modifications necessary for compliance, and direct the manufacturer, importer, or distributor to initiate a good recall. So let's now look at Tts Cs20, right? So this one is prepackaged goods compulsory requirements. Same as before, it's a draft national compulsory standard, and it will replace the Tts 76 Part 1, 1994. This standard, as mentioned, is being recommended for compulsory status as well. The main document that was used was the regional standards, CRS 52-2, right? And the regional standard was based on Trinidad regulation, or Trinidad national standard, a Canadian regulation, the Jamaican national standard, and the US Food and Drug Administrative, the US FDA. The contents of this standard is similar like the other one, goes into requirements. We look at conflict and then the mechanisms to demonstrate compliance and the measures related to non-compliance. So the scope of this standard says, this standard specifies requirements for the information to be included on labels of goods prepackaged for sale, distribution, and use in Trinidad and Tobago. The method of display of such information, and where necessary, the wording and unit of measurement to be used. So the exceptions are the same as above, right? Meaning that the standard does not apply to food, drugs, cosmetics, devices, pesticides, toxic chemicals, and agricultural produce. But we have some additional requirements for this one. Goods intended for export only, goods that are sold unpackaged or in an open or uncovered package, food that are weighed, measured, or counted in the presence of the purchaser with or without being packaged, gift wrapped goods, and marking on shipping containers, right? So these are also exceptions to the prepackaged goods standard. This standard, however, we have a normative reference, which means that to comply with the Tts 20, you need to also fulfill the requirements of the Tts 19, which is the general compulsory requirement, right? So you need to fulfill 19 and the requirements within 20. So in terms of the terms and definition, just highlighted two. Definition for package: any container, wrapping, confinement band, or card in which any good is to be sold, distributed, or used. And the definition for prepackaged goods: goods that are placed in the final package before sale and are sold, used, or purchased without further repacking. So in terms of the requirements, right? As mentioned, each package of the prepackaged goods shall be labeled in accordance with the Tts Cs20 and the requirements of this standard. The information required shall be placed on the principal display panel of the package. A label on package of prepackaged goods shall not give any erroneous impression of the good. The format for date marking shall be stated in a form which is unambiguous and acceptable to Ttbs. And within the standard, we actually list some acceptable date marking formats, right? Now, as I said, this is just an overview. So here, I'm just highlighting some of the requirements. The standard has much more. Some more. So no reference shall be made on a label or on a package to any warning or guarantee for any good unless a copy of the warranty or guarantee is given to the purchaser or user at the time of possession of the good. And then we have instructions for use or care in handling shall be included on the label or accompanying document as necessary to ensure correct utilization of the good. So in terms of the other clauses, like the clause 5, 6, and 7, they're the same as the Tts Cs20, right? So in terms of the conflict clause, the mechanism for demonstration, and the measures related to non-compliance, the same applies here, right? And that's the end of our review. So just to mention in terms of our efforts to put the standard out, we would have advertised in the daily newspapers to make the public aware of the standards. This was the ad that we had in the daily newspapers. This is the ad here. And we advertised over a 3-day period. We also had the standard up on the Ttbs website, and we also did some social media postings as well. Nadita would have mentioned the WTO notification, and of course the stakeholder consultation that we're having now. So in terms of how you could submit comments, right? You can email your comments, right, to the email address here, which is my email address. And if you go onto Ttbs website, you would be able to download the stakeholder comment form. So I got a query in terms of how to complete the form. So I'll just run through how you can complete the form. In terms of the clause number, you put the clause number here, right? The type of comment, if it's an editorial comment, if it's a general comment, a technical comment, and actually at the bottom of the comment table, well, you're not seeing it here, but they actually identify the different types of comment that could be submitted, right? So you put your comment here, then you put your reason for, or your justification, or why you want that, the reason for change, why you want to see whatever requirement being changed, and then you put your new suggestion, right? It's always important that you include probably suggested or proposed wording that you would prefer, and it's important to also put your justification, because that is what will help us make a determination, you know, on how we treat or address your comments. And the deadline date, right, for submitting comments is until the end of this month. We have until the 30th of November, 2021. So we actually have 2 additional weeks within which you could submit your comments. And that's it for me. Nadita would have mentioned that at the end of this session, when we're finished, then we would be addressing any comments or questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Nkechi. So one of the key points Nkechi raises the extension and the use utilization of the comment form. That is very important for us because we need to be able to get a technical evaluation of any comments raised by stakeholders. So please take the opportunity to submit any comments. I'm seeing some comments already in the chat, but we will deal with those after we hear from Ms. Sherian Ramnarain. So Sherian is an inspector in our implementation division at Ttbs, and she has been employed at Ttbs for the last 22 years and having a lot of experience in different departments of the Ttbs. She has been an inspector for around 12 years, and also she has a lot of experience in the implementation division and with regard to different types of goods. She also has a BSc in occupational safety and health. So I'll now turn the session over to Sherian to deliver her presentation to highlight the inspection process that is generally used by Ttbs to enforce our labeling standards. So Sherian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadita. Okay, good morning, everyone. As Nadita said, I will talk about the enforcement activities for the two standards. The PowerPoint will talk about powers of the Ttbs as legislated in the Act, powers of the inspectors, terms and conditions of the inspection, and inspections and market surveillance activities. So clause 23(2) of the Act speaks to manufactured goods, and it says, where a compulsory standard is declared in order to protect the consumer or user against danger to health or safety, and goods fail to conform to the required standard, such goods may neither be exported nor released for home use, but shall be disposed of as the Bureau may reasonably decide. Now, when they say home use here, it means anywhere within Trinidad and Tobago. So whether it's in the store, whether it's sold on the side of the road, whether it's in your house for use within Trinidad and Tobago. Clause 24(5), which speaks to imported goods, says that where there is a reason to believe that goods imported or about to be imported are likely to be a danger to the health or safety of consumers, or likely to threaten the environment, whether a standard exists for such goods or not, the Bureau may require the importer or vendor to submit such goods for testing, and the goods may only be entered for home use or sold if A, upon examination of the goods, they are found to be safe, and B, the Bureau or vendor shows proof satisfactory to the Bureau that the goods are safe. So most of you present would have experience with inspectors from the implementation division coming to your premises for inspections. These inspectors carry powers according to the Act, some of which one are to prevent the access to the market of goods likely to be a danger to the health and safety of consumers, request to enter any place where he has reasonable grounds to believe any article covered by the Act is manufactured, prepared, stored, or offered for sale, and to examine such articles. Inspectors can open and examine any receptacle or package that they have reasonable grounds to believe contains any article to which the Act applies. They can examine any books, documents, or other records found in any place which they have reasonable grounds to believe contain any information relevant to enforcement of the Act. They can examine any customs entries relating to the goods referred to in Section 24, and they can take samples of the goods and submit the samples to the Bureau or to a designated test facility for analysis or examination. They can seize and detain for such time as may be necessary any article by means of which or in relation to which they have reasonable grounds to believe any provision of the Act has been infringed. When import documents are processed on the Ttbs link platform, terms and conditions are agreed to, both by the Bureau, the Ttbs, and by the importer or the agent. So the Ttbs agrees to adhere to the principles of impartiality and shall not allow commercial, financial, or other pressures to compromise impartiality. The Bureau agrees to ensure that all information obtained during the course of its activities remain confidential, except for information that the client makes publicly available. They agree to provide products and services consistent with the requirements of the Standards Act, the Metrology Act, and their respective regulations in order to improve the quality of products and services produced or used in Trinidad and Tobago, facilitate industrial efficiency and development, improve public and industrial welfare by promoting health and safety, and protect the environment. The Bureau also agrees to inspect goods within a timely manner after processing documents on the Ttbs link portal, and to undertake inspection activities impartially in keeping with the inspection body's anti-bribery, anti-corruption policy, and conflicts of interest management policy. The inspection body shall not allow commercial, financial, or other pressures to compromise impartiality. The importer, the manufacturer, and the agent, they agree to ensure that any technology, machinery, plant, or material to be inspected by the Bureau's inspection personnel is in a safe environment and which pose low level or no risk to the inspection personnel. They are to ensure facilities and or premises where inspections are conducted adhere to the guidelines of the Ttbs and or the OSH Act, the Standards Act, and any other applicable legislation. They are to ensure facilities and or premises have sufficient lighting to allow for clear observation of the goods, ensure goods are at a location and position that are easily accessible to the inspection personnel, and where applicable, ensure that the requisite labeling and or documents, inclusive of the EC82, the invoices, the bill of lading, receipts, etc., are available at the time of the inspection. They are to refrain from attempting to influence inspection personnel by means of cash, gifts, or other inducements, refrain from threatening inspection personnel with violence or otherwise, and refrain from using abusive language or otherwise acting aggressively towards inspection personnel. During the course of inspection activities, it may become necessary to take samples of relevant items for testing. Testing services may be procured from a subcontracted lab. Where samples of inspection items are taken for testing, items are not to be released for sale until advised by the Ttbs. Failure to meet and accommodate the aforementioned terms and conditions for inspection will result in the appropriate fines being charged under the Standards Act and its regulations. So we talk a little bit now on the inspection and the market surveillance activities. Goods would be held for inspection at premises. Ttbs will visit and goods would be inspected. The items will be released for sale when conformance has been determined. Manufactured goods will be inspected at the end of a selected production run, and the frequency of these inspections will be determined by the Ttbs. The sampling plan we currently use is the ISO 2859-1 if we are taking samples for testing. So this chart demonstrates the process flow for an inspection. Without samples for testing, the process should take 2 to 3 working days. If samples are taken for testing, the process may take 7 working days or even more accordingly. So there's the importation and or the manufacture of the goods. Then the items are held at the importer's premises or the manufacturer's premises. The Ttbs inspector will visit to conduct a label assessment and to take the sample for testing if necessary. On conducting the label assessment, if the inspector finds that the labeling does not meet the requirements and something or the other from the labeling is missing, the importer or the manufacturer has the opportunity, they will be given the opportunity to modify the labeling to meet the requirements. If samples are taken for testing, the samples are sent to the lab, and based on the results coming out from the lab, if the items conform, they are released for sale. If the items do not conform, they need to be reshipped or destroyed. Some of the benefits of the services of the implementation division. Well, consumers are entitled to well-designed, safe products that are fit for their intended purpose. As such, it is the work of the Bureau, or rather the implementation division, to remove and prohibit substandard goods, to prevent illegal trading practices, to ensure a level playing field, to protect the environment, to ensure value for money purchases, to ensure minimum labeling requirements to empower consumers, to educate the public on items covered by compulsory standards, and to collaborate with other agencies to ensure compliance of goods. My supervisor is Ms. Carla Smith. She's the head of the prepackaged goods unit. Her email address is there, you all can notice. So even after this meeting is completed, if you have questions, you can always email. Thank you very much for your attention this morning.
Thank you, Cherry Ann, for giving us the overview of the inspection process, as well as highlighting some key aspects of the Standards Act. So the next agenda item is where, we would discuss any comments and queries received, and we have just a few of them thus far. So I will start with a query from Mr. Daniel. Good morning. If my label is compliant with Tts Cs20, will it also be compliant with CRS 55 Part 1? Will they be aligned? So I will turn that question over to Nikeshi, and I encourage all the participants to raise their questions in the chat so that we can discuss them today.
Hi, thanks, Nadita. Okay, so that's a very good question. So in the process of us reviewing the standard, we would have included some national deviations, meaning that we would have changed those items within the regional standard that we think were not applicable to our situation nationally. So one of the main things is the scope of the regional standard. So the scope of the regional standard, the intent is that it covers all goods, right? But however, based in Trinidad and Tobago, our particular situation, as mentioned, we are not responsible for food, drugs, cosmetics, pesticides, toxic chemicals, that list, right? So the exclusions that we would have included within our standard does not align with the regional standards. So that is that's one difference. The other thing is that we seek to clarify some areas within the regional standard nationally. So for example, in regional standard, they mention retail sale a lot, and the intent is that it will cover everything for sale or used. But we thought that it would be better if we use the terms, we used the terms goods used for, we used, let me just pull it up. The term that we use throughout is sold, distributed, and used in Trinidad and Tobago. So, we have some minor things like that. One of the major requirements, however, is the font size. So in the regional standard, they would have looked at the minimum font size that is recommended for the label, and they would have referenced the US FDA, right? And their requirement speaks to the minimum size as per the size of the display panel, right? However, in our national standard, we decided that we would have used a EU regulation, which actually allows, well, it's a kind of adaptation of an EU regulation. The EU regulation actually allows a smaller font size. When we first looked at the regional standard and we put it out there, we got feedback that they found that the minimum font size that was being recommended within the regional standard was not small enough for those products that, that require a lot of information and it's a small package. So we looked globally again, and then we decided that we would have adapt the EU regulation. And why I say adapt is because the EU regulation speaks to the minimum font size, but it also has measurement in terms of when you could use the 0.9 as opposed to the 1.2, right? In terms of the size of the label, we did not do that. We just have the minimum font size, it being 1.2 for cap for when it's all cap and 0.9 for when there's a mix of caps and lowercase. So that is one of the main requirements within the national standard that does not meet the requirements within the regional standard, right? Of course, that is if our national standard goes forward and is declared with what is being proposed in terms of the font size today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nkechi. So I'll go to the next question, and the question came in from Gail. Do these standards cover persons who vend on the roadside? So I will also invite our Sherian, but the standards cover, as Nkechi indicated, products sold, distributed, used in Trinidad and Tobago, and we have some exceptions. Sherian, do you want to comment on that particular question?
I would say yes, they would cover even the ones being sold at the side of the road.
And that is exactly what the national standard, these two standards are very generalized requirements. And I wanted to go to another question here. And the question is from Diana. Can you give us a proposed date of entry into force? So I will just recap some of the steps that we have to follow in the development of these compulsory standards. So we are extending the public comment period, and we're going to the 30th of November. Once all the comments are received and considered, then we will update the draft, and depending on how significant the comments are and what are the material issues we need to address, we may choose to take it again to the advisory committee, or we may determine that the changes are satisfactory and submit it to our board of directors for approval. After that process is done, then we are required to get the legal notices published. I mentioned the legal notice of declaration. So that is the first legal notice. And after that is published, we will liaise with our Ministry of Trade and Industry to obtain two legal notices. So the first one is the notice of intention to declare the standard compulsory, and it is followed by the compulsory standards order, which is the legal instrument that gives legal status. What Ttbs would do is that our implementation division, they would hold a stakeholder rollout meeting and ensure that the key stakeholders, or the manufacturers, the importers, are aware of the requirements, and they will announce a moratorium. So to answer the question, the proposed date of entry into force, it will be contingent on that stakeholder rollout meeting, and the implementation division would coordinate that particular meeting with stakeholders to announce the time frame that we will give for goods to come into compliance. So Cherry, and I don't know if you wanted to comment on that as well.
Nadita, you're accurate with that. When we do have the stakeholder rollout meeting, then further information would be given by the manager of the implementation division.
Thank you, Cherian. And there's a comment really from Anita, and the presentations will be shared with the persons who have registered for today's session. So Nkechi will be the primary contact. We will provide our contact details in the event that there are any other queries, but next week we will send out the presentations. And we will also attach the comment form, because any comments that we need to address, it is very important that we have technical justifications to support the proposed changes. And I wanted now to go to a question from Satira. So, is there specified criteria that is needed for the support and evidence used to substantiate claims? Example, if an outsourced product has a technical specification that states gluten-free, that can be used as evidence to substantiate the claim, or will I need a test from an accredited lab? So I will start with the latter part of the question. So the example, gluten-free, as Nakeshi indicated, we are not responsible for food, drugs, and cosmetics. But given the broader question, so if there is a claim that needs to be substantiated, evidence would have to be provided. And the mechanisms to demonstrate compliance in clause 5 essentially allows Ttbs to ask for further information, and that has to be acceptable to the Ttbs. So, Cherry, and I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, or Nakeshi.
Yes, Nadita, so that's accurate. And we would have spoken about the method that could be used to substantiate a claim. Not a claim, I mean, to provide additional information when we spoke about the third party, that being used as evidence that you could submit on behalf of your, to support your label. Yes.
So I just wanted to add, so these two standards are very general. So one deals with general requirements, and then we go further to prepackaged goods. What the compliance clause would do, it allows Ttbs to do that case-by-case assessment to really target the specific product and ensure that the information is aligned to the requirements of the standard, and where we need to get very specific in terms of evaluating the claim. The subclause 5.1.2 in the draft standard really allows Ttbs to look at the very specific product, because as Nakeshi would have indicated before, we have an order of precedence. So we have a number of very product specific standards, and then we also have a number of labeling standards that cover specific product categories. So we would have to go through that type of assessment. Now, where there's no product-specific standard or labeling standard that covers a product category, these two standards will apply. So it is very important that all the participants carefully review how the compliance clause is laid out, as well as that issue of precedence and any conflicts with other standards and laws, because where there are pieces of legislation, that would also take priority. So thank you for that question. It was a very good question, because we would sometimes need to look at a new product and then do that case-by-case assessment if it is something that we have not seen before. And this happens if they're innovative products entering the marketplace as well, but they still need to be properly labeled. I will now go to a question. Oh, so Nakeshi, go ahead.
No, I was going to just read out exactly what it says in the standard under 5.1.2. When you talk about Ttbs having the right, may consider. So it says Ttbs may consider and accept information from other sources, such as the third-party testing, product certification, and or quality management system certification from an accredited body, right? So that is potentially saying that, as in vitro, that if we require that additional information, those are the type of documents that you could provide to help substantiate your claim, or whatever evidence.
So Nakeshi, what could be useful if you want to share your screen as well while we go through some of the other questions? So you have the standard up.
Sure.
So I'll just give you like 2 minutes to organize that, and I will go into a question from Vandana. If the label has manufactured by, which is also the country of origin, what would be the need to declare the country of origin separately? And then she would have indicated the requirement to declare the country of origin can be conflicting with other regulations. So Nakeshi, would you like to address that part of it?
Okay, I just pulling up. Oh yes, it's up. Okay.
Yes, it's
so
up.
let me just go to that. Yes, so we would have discussed and Sherry, you could jump in here as well, because we would have discussed that within when we were looking at the standard, if the country of origin, if your product states the country of origin one time, if there is need to repeat. And Sherry, so my understanding of what exists now is that they are not required once the country of origin is within the label already.
That's right, Nikeshi. If it's included, if it says manufactured by, and it has the full name and address inclusive of the country, then we accept it.
Thank you, Nikeshi and Cherry. And I think this addresses the second part of Vandana's question, because she was indicating that the US regulations only mandate the declaration of either the manufacturer's address without preceding text manufactured by, or distributor's name and address with the preceding text distributed by. So I believe that Sharon and Nikeshi would have answered that part of it, right? So Nikeshi, are you going to demonstrate another document for us? Okay, so while Nikeshi locates a document, there's a question that really relates to implementation, and particularly Cherian. What kind of documents would Ttbs request from us, meaning the importers, the manufacturer, for importation of or goods that will be inspected at premises? So, Cherry, could you tell us the kind of documentation that would be required for the importers?
I would pass that question on to my supervisor and let her email a response.
Okay, no problem. So, Diana, we will get back to you via email. So I'm not seeing any additional questions, but please let us know in the chat if there are any more concerns. And Nikeshi, did you want to highlight any particular clauses from the draft standards?
Hi, sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute before, but let me just show you. Okay, so this is an example of, I guess, what was being discussed. So this label has manufactured by ABC, Trinidad and Tobago. So, and then this label too, we have so because it has the address already has the country, right? It is not necessary to have manufactured in Trinidad again, right? So this is the clarification here, I guess. Based on the question that was being asked, if we need to repeat. So this here is not needed. Let me just put on my pointer. Okay. But yeah, so this manufactured in Trinidad is not needed. This here is not needed, okay? Yes. So
Nikeshi. So I just wanted to read one point that came up from Vandana. Is it possible to include this explanation in the standard, please? So maybe in response to that, what we can do is look to include some sample labels, like what Nikeshi would have demonstrated in an informative annex, just to provide some additional guidance. So we'll take that comment on board as a possibility.
Okay, sure.
So let me check if there are any more questions. So please type any additional questions in the chat. Nikeshi, you can probably do a scroll through of the standard to highlight the layout so that we can, just familiarize ourselves with how standard is structured.
Okay, sure.
And in the meantime, I encourage anyone with questions to put it in the chat so we can address them.
So as we would have mentioned, right, this is the table of contents, right? Actually, in the forward, we would have identified some of the changes that were made to the new proposed standard as opposed to the standard that is current now, which is the Tts 76. Part 1, right? So we have improved definitions, we have some clarifications, inclusion of the font size, right? And the compliance clause. And as you would see here, we have more definitions than I would have gone through, right? So we have even instructions for use, what we mean when we say legible, the principal display panel, right? And then the additional requirements here. So the requirement just now was the question just now was based on this requirement here. So I've already made a note in terms of probably putting some examples. We'll see how we could facilitate that in the annex. This here is the modification for the type size in terms of the font size, right? So this it's very important, you know, because we would have received a lot of feedback previously when we would have put forward the font size that was in the regional standard. That is why we decided to change it to the EU regulation font size instead. So make sure, check your labels, you know, give us feedback to let us know if this is okay. And yeah, so as Nadita would have mentioned in terms of the mechanism to demonstrate compliance, we had a query in terms of 512 because I would have received some feedback from the public already. But just to let you all know that this is only required if you need to provide evidence of you complying with the requirements that were outlined previously, right? So this is not a mandatory. This is only as per if you think it's necessary or if the Ttbs requires you to submit an additional support, right? So I'll go to the part 20.
Nakeshi, before you switch or while you switch, there is a query from Nara Daniel, and it is a very interesting question that we have been discussing internally. Would a website for contact and ingredient listing be acceptable? So I invite Cherian to add her comments on the discussion thus far on this matter, the use of electronic tools to provide labeling information is one that we have raised internally and is something that we are considering. However, when the products are being sold to the normal everyday consumer, we would want a minimum level of information to be on the product itself. And the intent of the standards would be to apply to the broad cross-section of stakeholders. So we would not want to disadvantage any particular group of stakeholders by putting the information or making a requirement where the information has to be accessed in electronic format. So Cherian, you wanted to, share your perspective on this as well?
Well, I think you said it, but just to reiterate, if we go out to do inspections and the product label refers us to our website to get the ingredients, it's not accepted. The ingredients must be listed at this time on the product label itself.
Thank you, Cherian. So just a query from Ranu. Are we getting a copy of this document by email? She missed an hour of the meeting. So the documents are available online for review. So what Nikeshi is doing here is given a quick overview of the layout and the structure of the standard. And we had already committed earlier to share the presentations, but you would really have to go online via our Ttbs website to look at the draft standards. So Nikeshi is now going to go into the second part of the standard while I check the chat. Okay, so Nikeshi, you can go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, Nadita. So again, this is the additional definitions that I would not have gone through, but you would see that we have a lot more definitions in the part 20. Most of these definitions came from the regional standard, right? We, however, would have tailored some of them to our particular circumstance, right? So let me just, in terms of the general requirements, same as before, the common name of the good, some of the basic things. And I would have gone through just in terms of the position of the label, right? But here you would see it provides a lot more information, right? So that's why I encourage you to make sure and check out the standard and just don't look at the presentation, because the presentation doesn't go into all that detail. The presentation was just a snippet of the requirements. So in terms of the prevention of deception, right, it provides more explanation here as well. So in terms of the country of origin, so once your label does not provide any erroneous impressions, for example, you're saying that is Trinidad and Tobago, but you have a UK flag, of course, that causes some sort of confusion within the consumer or the user mind. So we want to make sure that the information is clear, right? And there is no misunderstanding. I would have mentioned in terms of the date marking, and I said that the standard would have provided some examples of the acceptable formats, right? So as you would see here, this is what we would accept. This is what we think is not acceptable because it's confusing, right? This, you don't know which one is the month, the date, or the year. So, the consumer should be able to figure out immediately what the date is by looking at it. And when we talk about display of hazardous warning, we speak to the Global Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, the GHS. Use that as your reference. And then, as before, the conflict clause and our mechanism to demonstrate compliance and what we do for non-compliance.
Thank you, Nkechi.
Right.
So I wanted to highlight, Nkechi, if you could just scroll to the top of the compliance clause, and with reference to one of the queries earlier, the difference between the regional and the national standards. Because this document is a compulsory standard, which is essentially a technical regulation or a piece of legislation for the country, we had to include the mechanisms to demonstrate compliance and basically outline the differences and different requirements for new goods and goods categorized other than new. I would invite Cherian to just comment on how used goods are treated or considered by the Ttbs, because it is very important that we follow the structure of the standard, because there are slightly different requirements. So second-hand goods, seconds being treated a bit differently within the document. And this is a very clear outline of what is required to demonstrate compliance. So Cherian, I turn it over to you to comment on that aspect.
Currently, used goods, we do 100% inspection. I guess when these standards are ruled out, by that time, discussions will be held within the implementation division. Management will decide how they're going to move forward with goods that are labeled seconds or so. But right now, what I can say is used goods, we do 100% inspection.
Thank you, Cherian. So now there's a question from Vandana. What would be the mandatory requirements for very small packages? And she went into some details here. The largest surface area, less than 25 centimeters squared. So Nkechi, do you want to tackle that one?
Yes, so let me just go to the requirement. So right now within the standard, we don't have any, the font size does not, the difference in the font size does not pertain to the size of the package. We left it open. So it's basically based on the type of font you're using. So if you're using all caps, or if you're using a mixed font. So let me just get, I'm in 20. Sorry, I will need to switch documents. So yes. So yes, so here. So as you would see, we left out the size of the display panel or the package, right? We just kept it simple and we said 1.2 millimeter for if it's all caps and 0.9 millimeter if it's mixed lower or upper, right? When we, as I said before, when we looked at the principal display panel and having a minimum size to go with a minimum font size, we got a lot of feedback where persons were saying that they find that this display panel should have this font size, or this display panel should have that font size. So that's why we looked outside. However, what we would have changed, because remember I told you that this requirement is actually an adaptation of the EU regulation, because the EU regulation actually has a size area for the 0.9 millimeter. But at that point in time, when we had the discussion with the external stakeholders, they felt that we should just leave it open, put it out to the public, and let's see what we get from there. So if you think, for example, that we should still include a minimum font size as it relates to your display panel, send us feedback, send us your justification, or send us your source, and we'll have a look at it.
So Nakeshi, there's some further clarification from Vandana. She was asking about the mandatory label elements, but the answer to that is the requirements are laid out in the draft standard. So there'll be cases where we have the minimum requirements, and then there's some degree of flexibility where, for example, like what is showing now, provide information regarding any specific dangers or precautions which might be related to the good and application, and provide first aid instruction where necessary. So depending on the product, the importer, the manufacturer would have to carefully review all the labeling requirements and make a determination as to what is applicable. And when Ttbs would do its enforcement, there may be further discussions in terms of what is needed on the label. So because these standards are very generalized, it is important that a very case-by-case assessment is done. But as Nakeshi indicated, please take the time to review the standards, the draft standards very carefully, because we want to ensure that we are being practical, realistic, enable the enforcement activities to happen. Because I would say it is very difficult to make changes after the standard has gone through the full approval process. So this is really the main period where comments can be addressed. So I encourage everyone to take a careful review, because these two standards, although they appear to be very simple, they can be very complex when you get down to what the specific products are. And as we would have indicated earlier, we have a number of other labeling standards that may take precedence. And in many cases, we have other standards, other product-related standards that will take precedence over any labeling standards. So I just wanted to address a query that I'm seeing from Mr. Daniel. If a label for a household item is US FDA compliant, would it be considered compliant as well? And when we establish compulsory standards, these are effectively the regulations for Trinidad and Tobago. So we have to demonstrate compliance to our national compulsory standards. So we cannot look at only what is required for the US FDA. We are not in the US. We are in Trinidad and Tobago. This is the purpose of having our national standards. And as Nakeshi would have indicated earlier, they are based on some of the regional standards for the CARICOM region. So the answer for this would be really, you would have to look at what are the requirements that we're proposing here for the national market. So I don't know if there are any additional questions. We will give 5 minutes again for any questions to go in the chat. So I would invite Mr. Rodney Ramnath, our Acting Executive Director, to basically just share his perspective as we seek to wrap up the meeting.
Nadita?
Yes, Nakeshi?
Sorry. Before you move on, I just wanted to highlight in terms of the question you would have asked, you would have addressed just now with the FDA. Just wanted to remind persons that remember our national standard does not apply to food, drugs, cosmetics, and pesticides, toxic chemicals. So any requirement, if you're looking at compliance with product labeling for food or a drug, you really need to go to the Food and Drug Division of the Ministry of Health and look at their regs and ensure that your food labeling complies with whatever is outlined in their regulations, right? And I think you missed one question that dealt with 19.3J, Nadita, in the chat.
Yes. Oh, right. So there was further explanation for the pictorial. So Nikeshi, you have the standard up already, so you can answer that one.
Right. So it says not contain any information by words, pictorial, or other devices which refer to or any suggestive, either directly or indirectly, or another good, with which such a product might be confusing or in such a manner as to lead the purchaser or user to suppose that the good is connected with such other product. So, I mean, I would have made reference to the country of origin being Trinidad and having a US flag. That's an example of one. But in terms of the product, so for example, if your product is one thing, like your product is a broom, no, I know that's not a. So this basically says that whatever your product is, the information on the label should reflect what your product is. So you shouldn't have a product for, say, soap and have a picture of something else on your label, right? So that's what we mean when we say it should not be confusing to the purchaser or the user. You have to make sure that if you're using pictures, your pictures are in line with what your product is, right? And that's what 3J is about. Or even the words that you're using on your label, right? Make sure that, and actually higher up speaks to using the common name of the product, you know, making sure that is there. So if your product is, say, shoes, you make sure that the common name is labeled on the product, right? So hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Nikeshi. So we're not seeing any more questions in the chat. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Ramnath to share his perspective as we seek to close today's meeting.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I just want to say thanks for coming to the meeting, and we do appreciate the comments, and we look forward to any other comments that you may have while we continue to review this particular standard. So again, thanks for coming, and I'll hand back over to you to end the program.
Thank you, Rodney. I'd like to thank all the participants for participating in today's session. We got some very useful questions, in particular, how we can, make the standard more clear by using some of the pictorial information. And we hope that we were able to clarify some of the questions, or, it is key to look at some of the exclusions. Nikeshi would have highlighted the food, drugs, cosmetics, pesticides. And we also encourage you to take a look at our standards database, because we have a number of labeling standards that may apply to your product. And we have a number of product-specific standards that may also apply. So on behalf of Ttbs, I'd like to thank all the participants. I would also like to thank Cherry and Nikeshi for their presentations today, as well as Rodney for being with us through the session. And we really look forward to further feedback. We want to ensure that we address all the issues within this public comment period. And we do not want issues to be raised at the end of the process when the standards are already declared compulsory, because it puts us in a position where we would have to go back through the standards development process. So the time for comments are now. We have till up to the end of this month, so the end of November. You can reach out to either myself or Nikeshi if there are any further queries. And again, just thanks for being with us today through the session, and we look forward to any further queries. And after the standards are approved, then we would hand over to our implementation division for them to do the stakeholder rollout. And this is where the moratorium will be announced, and this will allow time for any label adjustments to be made. So again, on behalf of Ttbs, thank you, and we value your time and contributions. Goodbye.